The gunshot echoed through the narrow canyon, sending a flock of startled birds into the crimson Arizona sky as Ramsey Cooper slumped against the sandstone wall, clutching his bleeding face. That bullet had been meant to kill him, but fate had other plans that would leave him marked forever, but alive enough to seek revenge against the men who'd ambushed him and stolen his family's cattle. It was 1883, and the territory surrounding Bisbee, Arizona, was as unforgiving as it was beautiful. Ramsey had spent 3 days unconscious in that canyon before a passing Chiricahua Apache scout found him and brought him to the tribal healer. By the time he was strong enough to ride again, the wound had sealed into a jagged scar that ran from his right temple down to his jaw, twisting his once handsome face into something that made children stare and women avert their eyes. "You will heal inside," the old healer had told him in broken English. "Outside stays to remind you." 6 months later, Ramsey guided his sorrel stallion through the dusty main street of Bisbee, his hat pulled low over his face. The mining town had grown considerably since he'd last visited. Silver and copper had brought prosperity, new buildings, and new faces that wouldn't recognize him or know his story. It was exactly what he wanted. He tied his horse at the hitching post outside the Copper Queen Hotel, the most reputable establishment in town. Inside, he approached the front desk, keeping his scarred side turned away from the clerk. "Room for the night," Ramsey said, placing coins on the counter. The young clerk, barely out of his teens, nodded nervously. "Yes, sir. Name for the register, Cooper, Ramsey Cooper." "Any bags to bring in, Mr. Cooper?" "Just my saddlebags." The clerk handed him a key. "Room 204 up the stairs, end of the hall." Ramsey nodded and turned toward the staircase, feeling the stares of the hotel patrons burning into his back. He'd grown accustomed to it over the months, the way people would catch a glimpse of his scarred profile and then quickly look away, embarrassed or disgusted. He didn't blame them. The first time he'd seen his reflection in a stream after the attack, he'd hardly recognized himself. He was halfway up the stairs when commotion erupted at the entrance. A woman's voice, clear and authoritative, cut through the usual saloon noise from the adjoining establishment. "I said I need a room for 2 nights, and I can most certainly pay for it." "I don't need your concern or your opinions about a woman traveling alone." Ramsey paused, watching as a slender woman with honey-brown hair stood her ground at the front desk. The same nervous clerk who had just attended to him was stammering excuses. "Miss, it's just not proper. Propriety won't build your railroad, sir," she replied. "But my survey will." Now the room, the woman was dressed practically a riding skirt, fitted jacket, and sturdy boots. She carried herself with the confidence of someone used to dealing with skeptical men. Something about her determination made Ramsey linger on the stairs. "We're nearly full," the clerk protested. "Only got 1 proper room left." "Then I'll take it," she said, placing money on the counter with a decisive gesture. The clerk reluctantly took the payment and handed her a key. "Room 206. As she turned toward the stairs, her eyes met Ramsey's for a brief moment. He instinctively turned his scarred side away, a habit born from months of avoiding curious or horrified stares. He continued up to his room without looking back. Inside room 204, Ramsey dropped his saddlebags onto the floor and removed his dusty hat. The room was simple but clean: a bed with iron frame, washstand with porcelain basin, small desk, and a window overlooking Bisbee's bustling Main Street. He poured water into the basin and washed the trail dust from his hands and face, careful around the still tender scar tissue. The face in the small mirror above the washstand remained a stranger to him. The man who had left his family ranch 6 months ago, the one with easy smiles and bright futures, was gone. In his place was this harder, grimmer version, with a face that told a story of violence without speaking a word. He'd come to Bisbee following rumors about the men who'd attacked him, the Blackwell gang, notorious cattle rustlers who'd been terrorizing ranches across the territory. Word was they'd set up operations near the mining town, using the confusion and constant influx of new people as cover for their illegal activities. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Ramsey instinctively reached for his Colt revolver before calling out, "Who is it?" "Room service, sir," came a female voice. "Fresh towels." Ramsey hesitated, then holstered his gun and opened the door, keeping to the shadows. It wasn't hotel staff but the woman from downstairs, standing with a determined expression and no towels whatsoever. "You're not room service," he said flatly. "And you're the man who was watching me downstairs," she replied. "I don't appreciate being studied like a curiosity." Ramsey adjusted his stance to keep his scarred side away from her direct view. "My apologies, madam. Wasn't my intention to make you uncomfortable." She tilted her head slightly, studying him with intelligent eyes. "You were the only person in that lobby not looking at me like I was some sort of oddity. A woman traveling alone tends to draw unwanted attention." "I understand something about unwanted attention," he said quietly. A moment of silence stretched between them. Her eyes softened slightly. "I'm Ruth Valens," she said, extending her hand. "I'm a surveyor for the Arizona and Southeastern Railroad Company." Ramsey hesitated before taking her hand. "Ramsey Cooper." "A pleasure, Mr. Cooper," she said, and then, with directness that surprised him, "You needn't hide your face on my account. I've seen worse wounds on the railroad men." Ramsey involuntarily touched the scar, a gesture he'd developed over the months. "It's habit by now, Miss Valens. Call me Ruth," she said. "And if you're not otherwise engaged this evening, I could use a dinner companion." Being a woman alone in a dining room invites either pity or proposition. Neither is conducive to enjoying a meal. Her forthrightness caught him off guard. For months, he'd kept to himself, avoiding extended interactions that might lead to questions about his scar or his past. "I'm in Bisbee on business," he said, offering the excuse automatically. "As am I, and business is always better discussed over food." She smiled slightly. "I'll be in the hotel dining room at 7. The choice to join me is yours, Mr. Cooper." With that, she turned and walked the few steps to her own room, leaving Ramsey standing in his doorway, uncertain about what had just happened. At precisely 7 o'clock, Ramsey found himself entering the hotel dining room, hat in hand. He'd cleaned up, changed his shirt, and combed his hair, though he couldn't have explained why he'd taken the extra effort. Perhaps it was simply that Ruth Valens had spoken to him like a normal person, not a damaged curiosity. She was already seated at a corner table, her back to the wall, a position Ramsey himself would have chosen, allowing clear views of both the entrance and the room. She wore the same practical clothes but had loosened her hair slightly from its earlier severe style. When she saw him, she nodded in greeting, her expression neutral but not unwelcoming. Ramsey approached, keeping his scarred side toward the wall as he took the chair opposite her. "Evening, Miss Valens." "Ruth," she corrected, studying him openly. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't come." "Nearly didn't," he admitted. "What changed your mind?" He considered her question as a waiter approached their table. After they ordered steak for him, chicken for her, Ramsey finally answered. "You didn't look away," he said simply. Understanding flickered in her eyes. "From your scar, why would I?" "Most people do." Ruth straightened the silverware beside her plate with precise movements. "I've spent 5 years working with the railroad, Mr. Cooper. I've seen men crushed by falling timber, burned by exploding steam engines, mangled in rock slides. Your scar indicates you survived something that might have killed another man. That's worthy of respect, not avoidance." Her matter-of-fact tone was refreshing after months of whispers and sidelong glances. "What brings a woman to railroad surveying?" he asked, genuinely curious. "My father was a civil engineer for the Union Pacific," she explained. "He taught me mathematics, drafting, and surveying from the time I was tall enough to hold a transit level. When he died 3 years ago, I already had enough reputation in the field that the company kept me on. They found my skills outweighed the inconvenience of my gender." "And you're surveying near Bisbee?" "The railroad wants to connect the mines directly to Benson," she said, her eyes lighting with enthusiasm. "It's challenging terrain, but I've plotted a route that could work. I'm here to finalize the surveys before construction begins." She paused as their food arrived. "And you, Mr. Cooper, what business brings you to our bustling metropolis?" Ramsey cut into his steak, considering how much to reveal. "I'm looking for someone, several someones actually, friends." She asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "The opposite," he said quietly. "They're the men who gave me this." He gestured to his scar. Ruth nodded, taking a bite of her chicken. "Revenge, then." "Justice," he corrected. "They didn't just mark me. They stole 200 head of cattle from my family's ranch, killed one of our hands. The law hasn't done anything about it. So you're taking matters into your own hands." It wasn't a question. Someone has to. They ate in silence for a few moments before Ruth spoke again. "It's a dangerous path, Mr. Cooper." "Ramsey," he said. "And yes, it is, but sometimes the right path and the safe path aren't the same." "A fair point," she conceded. "Though I imagine your family might prefer you alive and scarred rather than dead and avenged." Her words hit closer to home than she could have known. His mother had begged him not to go after the Blackwell gang, had pleaded with him to let the territorial marshals handle it. But after 3 months of official inaction, Ramsey had saddled his horse and ridden out, promising to return when justice was served. "My family understands duty," was all he said. Ruth studied him with those intelligent eyes that seemed to see more than he was comfortable revealing. "I don't doubt it. Just be certain you understand the difference between duty and obsession. I've seen good men consumed by the latter." Ramsey changed the subject. "How long will your surveying take?" "A week, perhaps 2, she replied, allowing the shift. "I need to verify some measurements in the canyons east of town. The terrain is challenging, but that's what makes the work interesting." "Sounds dangerous for a woman alone." A flash of irritation crossed her face. "I've managed similar terrain from Colorado to California, Mr. Cooper Ramsey. Being a woman doesn't make me incapable of handling a horse or a rifle." "I didn't mean to suggest it did," he said, raising his hands slightly in apology. "It's dangerous country for anyone alone. Apaches still raid occasionally, despite the reservations. And there are worse predators of the 2-legged variety." Her expression softened. "Fair enough. I do take precautions, and the railroad usually sends a security man, but he's delayed in Tucson until next week." The evening continued with easier conversation. Ruth spoke of her work with the railroad, the different territories she'd surveyed, the challenges and adventures she'd experienced. Ramsey found himself talking more than he had in months, sharing stories of his family's ranch outside Tombstone, the cattle business, even humorous tales from his younger days riding with the local cowboys. By the time they finished their meal, Ramsey realized he'd almost forgotten to keep his scarred side in the shadows. Almost. As they stood to leave the dining room, Ruth looked at him directly. "Thank you for the company, Ramsey. It was a pleasant change from eating alone." "The pleasure was mine," he replied, and was surprised to find he meant it. At the top of the stairs, as they reached their respective rooms, Ruth turned to him once more. "If you're not otherwise engaged tomorrow, I could use an escort for my first day of surveying." "I'd pay a fair wage for your time." Ramsey hesitated. His plan had been to begin asking discreet questions around town about the Blackwell gang's whereabouts. "I understand if your business takes priority," she added. Something about her calm, direct gaze made Ramsey reconsider. His revenge had waited this long, another day wouldn't matter. And the thought of riding through the hills with someone who didn't flinch at the sight of his face was unexpectedly appealing. "I'll be ready at dawn," he said. Ruth smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her serious face. "Good night then, Ramsey Cooper." "Good night, Ruth." Back in his room, Ramsey stood at the window, looking out at the darkened street below. Lamplight spilled from saloon doors, and occasional bursts of laughter or raised voices carried on the night air. Somewhere in or around this town, the men who had attacked him were going about their lives, unaware that their victim had survived and followed their trail. Yet for the first time in months, thoughts of revenge weren't the only ones occupying his mind. Ruth Valens was an unexpected complication, a woman who looked at his scar without pity or revulsion, who spoke to him as an equal, whose company he had genuinely enjoyed. Dawn broke clear and cool over the mountains surrounding Bisbee. Ramsey was already awake and dressed, checking his saddle and gear in the hotel's small stable when Ruth appeared, dressed in practical riding clothes and carrying a leather case that presumably held her surveying equipment. "You're prompt," she said by way of greeting. "I appreciate that in a working companion. My father always said the sun doesn't wait for lazy men," Ramsey replied, adjusting his hat. "Where are we headed today?" Ruth secured her case to a sturdy bay mare the stable hand had brought out for her. "Mule Canyon, east of town. There's a potential pass there that could save miles of track if it's navigable." They rode out of town as the mining settlement was coming to life, passing workers heading toward the massive Copper Queen mine that dominated the landscape. The terrain quickly became rugged as they followed a winding trail into the hills, mesquite and ocotillo dotting the slopes around them. Ruth rode confidently, handling her horse with the ease of someone who had spent considerable time in the saddle. She kept up a steady commentary about the landscape, pointing out features that would impact the railroad's construction grades too steep for locomotives, unstable soil conditions, areas prone to flash flooding. By mid-morning, they had reached a narrow canyon where Ruth dismounted and began setting up her equipment. Ramsey secured the horses to a scrubby juniper and scanned their surroundings, a habit born from years in dangerous country. "You said you grew up near Tombstone?" Ruth asked as she adjusted her transit. "About 20 miles north," Ramsey confirmed. "My father claimed land there in '67 before the Silver Strike, started with 50 head of cattle and built it up to over 2,000 by the time he died. And now it's your ranch." "Mine and my younger brother's. He's running things while I'm away." Ruth looked up from her equipment. "Does he know what you're doing?" "He knows. And he supports this vendetta." Ramsey's jaw tightened. "Thomas was there when they hit us. He saw what they did to our hand, old Francisco, who'd been with us since we were boys. They shot him down for trying to protect the herd, then shot me when I came running at the sound of gunfire. He touched his scar unconsciously. If Thomas wasn't needed at the ranch, he'd be riding with me." Ruth held his gaze for a long moment before returning to her work. "I'm sorry about your man. No one deserves to die that way." They worked through the morning, Ramsey helping Ruth move equipment, holding the measuring rod where directed and keeping watch. The work was methodical and precise, Ruth making careful notes and sketches in a leather-bound journal. Around midday, they stopped to eat the lunch the hotel had packed for them: bread, cheese, dried fruit, and beef jerky. They sat in the shade of a large boulder, the narrow canyon providing some relief from the strengthening sun. "You're good at this," Ruth commented, taking a drink from her canteen. "Patient. Most men I hire get restless after an hour. Ranch work teaches patience," Ramsey said. "And it's peaceful out here, different from—" He trailed off, not wanting to revisit thoughts of revenge that had been surprisingly absent for most of the morning. "Different from hunting men," Ruth finished for him. Ramsey nodded, looking out across the rugged landscape. "This is honest work. Simple, you measure, you calculate, you build, everything has a purpose. And revenge didn't say that." He met her gaze. "But this what you're doing creates something. Revenge just settles debts." Ruth considered this, her head tilted slightly. An interesting distinction. She brushed crumbs from her skirt and stood. "We should finish here before the afternoon heat becomes unbearable." They worked for another 2 hours before Ruth declared herself satisfied with the day's measurements. As they packed up her equipment, the distant rumble of thunder warned of an approaching storm. "We should head back," Ramsey said, eyeing the darkening clouds to the east. "Flash floods are common in these canyons." They mounted quickly and rode at a steady pace toward Bisbee. The storm moved faster than expected, however, and they were still several miles from town when fat raindrops began to fall, quickly becoming a downpour. "There," Ramsey pointed to a small line shack nestled among some rocks about 100 yards off the trail. "We can wait it out there." By the time they reached the shack, they were both soaked. The abandoned structure was simple: one room with a dirt floor, a small wood stove, and crude shelves along one wall. It was dry, though, and offered protection from the intensifying storm. Ramsey quickly checked for snakes or other unwelcome inhabitants before helping Ruth inside with her equipment. He found some old kindling and managed to start a small fire in the stove while Ruth wrung water from her hair and jacket. "Quite an adventure for your first day of surveying," Ramsey commented, removing his own sodden coat. "Hardly my first storm," Ruth replied, though her teeth chattered slightly from the chill, "though I appreciate not having to weather it alone." The small fire began to warm the shack as rain drummed on the tin roof. Ramsey hung their coats near the stove to dry and offered Ruth his relatively dry bandana to finish drying her face. "Thank you," she said, taking it. As she wiped her face, her eyes fell on his scar, fully visible in the dim light of the shack. For the first time, he didn't turn away. "How did you survive it?" she asked quietly. "The shooting." Ramsey touched the scar, tracing its path from temple to jaw. "Luck, mostly. The bullet hit at an angle, tore along rather than through. I managed to fall into a dry wash where they couldn't see me from horseback. They assumed I was dead and rode off with the cattle. And then I crawled about a mile before passing out from blood loss. An Apache found me, brought me to his people. Their healer saved my life." Ruth's eyes remained on his face, studying the scar with clinical interest rather than disgust. "They did good work. Many white doctors would have done worse." "The healer was a woman," Ramsey said. "She told me the scar would remain to remind me of what was taken and what was spared." "Wise words," Ruth murmured. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the small fire and the steady drumming of rain. Ramsey found himself studying Ruth's face, in return the intelligence in her hazel eyes, the determined set of her jaw, the few freckles across her nose that revealed time spent outdoors. "You're staring," she said finally, but without accusation. "So were you," he countered. A small smile curved her lips. "Fair point, though I was examining a wound, not whatever it is you're doing," she finished, a hint of color rising in her cheeks. "Trying to understand you," Ramsey admitted. "You're unlike any woman I've met. Because I work." "Many women work, Mr. Cooper. Because you look at me at this," he gestured to his scar, "and don't turn away. Because you speak your mind without apology. Because you're out here surveying canyons when most women would." "Would what? Sit safely at home, embroidering handkerchiefs." There was an edge to her voice now. "I meant no offense," he said quickly. "I admire it, your independence, your courage." The tension in her shoulders eased slightly. "I was raised to believe capability matters more than convention. My father saw no reason why being female should limit my education or ambitions. He sounds like a remarkable man." "He was." Her expression softened with memory. "He would have liked you, I think. He had little patience for pretense." Outside, the storm began to slacken, the heavy downpour giving way to a steady rain. Within the shack, however, something had shifted in the atmosphere between them, a recognition of mutual respect, perhaps, or something deeper that neither was ready to name. "We should be able to ride back soon," Ramsey said, moving to check their coats by the stove. Ruth nodded, accepting the change of subject. "Yes, I'd rather not spend the night explaining to the hotel clerk why his assumptions about impropriety were correct after all." Ramsey couldn't help but smile at that, a genuine expression that felt foreign on his face. We wouldn't want to give him the satisfaction. 30 minutes later, the rain had subsided enough for them to continue their journey. The trail was muddy but passable, and they reached Bisbee just as dusk was falling. The town glowed with lamplight, the wet streets reflecting the illumination from saloons and storefronts. At the hotel stable, Ramsey helped Ruth down from her horse, his hands lingering briefly at her waist. "Thank you for your help today," she said, looking up at him with those direct eyes. "Would you join me for dinner again?" "I'd be honored," Ramsey replied, surprised at how much he meant it. After changing into dry clothes, they met in the hotel dining room, both tacitly agreeing to the same table they'd shared the previous night. Over dinner, their conversation flowed more easily, covering everything from books they'd read to places they hoped to see. "Have you ever been to San Francisco?" Ruth asked as they lingered over coffee. Ramsey shook his head. "Never been further west than Yuma." I worked on the survey for the coastal line last year. It's unlike anywhere else, fog rolling in from the ocean, buildings climbing impossible hills, people from every corner of the world. Sounds overwhelming. It was, at first, she admitted, but there's something liberating about a place where everyone is from somewhere else. No one quite belongs, so in a way, everyone does. Ramsey considered this, and no one stares at what makes you different. Precisely. Her eyes met his. Though I've found that what makes us different is often what makes us interesting. Later, as they stood in the hallway between their rooms, Ramsey found himself reluctant to end the evening. "Would you like help again tomorrow?" he offered. Ruth smiled. "I would, though I should warn you will be covering more difficult terrain. The work will be harder." "I'm not afraid of hard work." "No," she said softly. "I don't imagine you are afraid of much, Ramsey Cooper." Their eyes held for a long moment before Ruth broke the connection, turning toward her door. "Good night, then. Dawn again." "Dawn," he confirmed. In his room, Ramsey stood at the window once more, looking out at the night-darkened town. His original purpose in coming to Bisbee, finding the Blackwell gang, seemed suddenly less urgent. For the first time in months, he had spent an entire day without being consumed by thoughts of revenge. Instead, his mind was filled with images of Ruth, her confident handling of the technical equipment, her easy seat in the saddle, the way raindrops had clung to her eyelashes in the lined shack, the directness of her gaze when she looked at his scarred face. The next morning dawned clear, the storm having washed the dust from the air and left the distant mountains sharply defined against the blue sky. Ramsey was waiting with the horses when Ruth appeared, carrying her equipment case and what looked like a rifle scabbard. "You're armed today," he observed as they mounted. "Always prudent in remote areas," she replied. "Apache raids may be less common now, but there are still bandits and wild animals to consider." They rode east again, but along a different trail that took them higher into the mountains. The terrain grew increasingly rugged, forcing them to dismount and lead their horses across particularly difficult sections. By midday, they had reached a high ridge overlooking a sweeping valley. Ruth set up her equipment while Ramsey secured the horses and kept watch, the elevation giving him a clear view of the surrounding country. "This would be an ideal place for an ambush," he commented, scanning the rocks above them. Ruth glanced up from her transit. "Are you expecting trouble?" "In my experience, it's best to expect it and be pleasantly surprised when it doesn't appear." "A rather grim outlook," she observed, making a notation in her journal. "Realistic," he corrected, "though I'll admit recent events have colored my perspective." They worked through the afternoon, the surveying more challenging in the steep terrain. Ramsey found himself impressed by Ruth's stamina and determination. When a piece of equipment slipped from her grasp and skittered toward the edge of a drop-off, she didn't hesitate to secure herself to a rock outcropping with a length of rope before retrieving it. "You've done that before," he said as she returned safely with the brass instrument. "3 years ago in Colorado," she confirmed. "Lost a good transit that way before I learned to bring rope." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, they packed up and prepared for the return journey. The route back would take them near a small waterfall Ruth had noted on previous expeditions, and they agreed to stop there to refill their canteens. The waterfall was modest but lovely, tumbling about 15 feet from a rocky ledge into a clear pool. They let the horses drink downstream while Ruth filled their canteens with the cold, fresh water. "It's beautiful here," she said, looking up at the cascade. "Sometimes I get so focused on the technical aspects of the land that I forget to appreciate it." Ramsey nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Ranch work can be the same way. You're so concerned with grass quality and water sources that you miss the sunset. Ruth smiled at him, water droplets glistening on her hands. "Exactly. Though I imagine your scar has given you a different perspective on many things." "It has," he admitted, "makes a man reconsider what matters." "And what matters to Ramsey Cooper?" she asked, her tone light but her eyes serious. Before he could answer, the crack of a rifle shot echoed through the small canyon. Instinctively, Ramsey threw himself toward Ruth, knocking her to the ground behind a large boulder as dirt kicked up where she had been standing. "Are you hit?" he demanded, shielding her body with his own. "No," she gasped, her eyes wide with shock but clear. "Where did it come from?" Ramsey cautiously peered around the boulder, scanning the ridgeline above them. "There," he pointed to movement among rocks about 200 yards away, at least two of them. Another shot rang out, chipping stone from their protective boulder. "Apaches?" Ruth whispered. "No," Ramsey said grimly. "Apache wouldn't miss twice, and they'd be closer." He reached for his revolver. "Can you make it to the horses?" Ruth assessed the situation with remarkable calm. "Not without crossing open ground. We'd be easy targets." "My rifle's in the scabbard," Ramsey muttered. "Useless to us now." "Mine isn't," Ruth said, reaching for her belt knife. She cut a strip from the hem of her riding skirt and quickly tied back her hair. "I can reach it if you provide covering fire." Ramsey looked at her in surprise. "That's too dangerous." "More dangerous than sitting here waiting for them to circle around," she countered. "I'm faster than I look, Ramsey." Before he could argue further, another shot ricocheted off the rocks above them, sending fragments raining down. Whoever was shooting had shifted position, trying for a better angle. 3 shots, Ruth noted. "They'll need to reload soon if they're using single-shot rifles." Ramsey nodded, impressed by her tactical awareness. "On my signal, then. I'll fire to keep their heads down. You run for the rifle. Stay low." He waited until the 4th shot rang out, then leaned around the boulder and fired 3 rapid rounds toward the distant figures. Ruth darted from their cover, running in a crouch toward her horse. Ramsey continued firing, forcing the ambushers to stay hidden. Ruth reached her horse, pulled the rifle from its scabbard, and dove behind another boulder as more shots kicked up dirt around her. She chambered a round in the Winchester repeater and signaled to Ramsey. Together, they provided enough covering fire to keep the attackers pinned down. During a lull, Ruth called out, "If we can make it to those rocks to the right, we'd have a better position and a path back to the trail." Ramsey nodded. "I'll go first, then cover you." He waited for Ruth to lay down suppressing fire, then sprinted to the cluster of rocks she had indicated. Once there, he signaled for her to follow, providing his own covering fire as she ran, rifle in hand. "Any idea who they are?" She asked breathlessly as she joined him. "Could be bandits after your surveying equipment," Ramsey said. Or the men you're looking for," Ruth finished. "The Blackwell gang." Another volley of shots forced them deeper into the rocks. They were in a better defensive position now, but still trapped. "We need to get back to town before dark," Ruth said, checking her ammunition. "I have 16 rounds left." "I've got 9 in the revolver," Ramsey added. "They seem to be trying to work their way around to the east. If we move west through these rocks, we might be able to reach the horses." Ruth nodded. "Lead the way." They moved carefully through the rocky terrain, using natural cover to shield their movement. Occasionally, one of them would fire toward their attackers, keeping them hesitant to advance. Finally, they reached a position where they could see their horses, still tethered but nervous from the gunfire. "I count 3 men," Ruth whispered, peering carefully around a boulder. "They're spread out, trying to flank us." Ramsey's jaw tightened. "Can you make out any details?" "One has a red bandana, another is wearing what looks like a battered cavalry hat." Ramsey's blood ran cold. The description matched 2 of the Blackwell gang members. "It's them," he said quietly. "They must have recognized me in town." Ruth's eyes widened slightly. "This is my fault." "If you hadn't been helping me, no," Ramsey cut her off. "This was coming one way or another." He checked his revolver. "I need you to listen carefully. When I start firing, you run for the horses. Don't wait for me, just ride for town as fast as you can." "I'm not leaving you here," she said firmly. "This isn't your fight." "It became my fight when they shot at me," Ruth replied, her voice steady. "I'm not abandoning you to face 3 men alone." Before Ramsey could argue further, one of the attackers called out, "Cooper, we know it's you." "Thought you were dead back in that wash." Ramsey's hand tightened on his gun. "Blackwell," he muttered, "you want revenge for that pretty face of yours." The voice continued. "Why don't you come out and face me like a man?" Ruth touched Ramsey's arm. "It's a trap," she whispered. "They want you angry enough to make a mistake." Ramsey nodded, forcing himself to think clearly despite the rage burning through him. You're right, we need a diversion. Ruth considered for a moment, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small brass object. Surveyor's flare, she explained. For signaling at distances, if I set it off over there, she pointed to a clump of dry brush about 30 yards away, it might draw their attention long enough for us to reach the horses. Do it, Ramsey agreed. Ruth carefully aimed and threw the flare, which ignited upon impact, sending up a bright red flame and a plume of smoke. Immediately, several shots were fired toward the unexpected light. Now, Ramsey hissed, they ran for the horses, keeping low. Ruth reached her mare first and quickly untied both animals. As Ramsey swung into the saddle, a shot rang out and he felt the burn of a bullet grazing his left arm. Ride, he shouted to Ruth, wheeling his horse toward the trail. They galloped away from the ambush site, bullets kicking up dust behind them. Only when they had put considerable distance and several bends in the trail between themselves and their attackers did they slow to a more sustainable pace. You're hit, Ruth said, noticing the blood soaking through Ramsey's sleeve. Just a graze, he assured her, though it burned like fire. Keep moving, they might follow. They rode hard until they reached more open country where it would be difficult for anyone to approach unseen. Only then did Ruth insist they stop long enough for her to examine Ramsey's wound. Take off your shirt, she ordered, dismounting and retrieving a small kit from her saddlebag. It's nothing, Ramsey protested, though he complied, wincing as the fabric pulled away from the wound. Ruth cleaned the bloody furrow with water from her canteen and a clean handkerchief. You're lucky. It's not deep, but it needs binding. She efficiently applied a small jar of salve from her kit and wrapped the wound with strips of clean cloth. Railroad surveying teaches first aid as well, she explained as she worked. Too many miles from doctors. Ramsey watched her capable hands as she tended his injury. Thank you, he said quietly. You handled yourself well back there. Most people would have panicked. Ruth secured the bandage and looked up at him. Panic is a luxury for safer circumstances. Her eyes were steady, but he could see she was processing the danger they had just escaped. Those were the men who scarred you? Some of them, Ramsey confirmed, pulling his torn shirt back on. The one who called out that was Blackwell himself. He leads the gang. And now they know you're alive and in Bisbee, Ruth said, her brow furrowing. They'll come looking for you. Let them, Ramsey said grimly. Ruth mounted her horse again. We need to alert the sheriff when we get back to town. Ramsey gave a bitter laugh. The law has had 6 months to find them. They've done nothing. Then we'll make them do something, Ruth insisted. I have connections with the railroad security office. They don't take kindly to their surveyors being shot at. They rode the rest of the way to Bisbee in tense silence, both scanning the terrain for any sign of pursuit. The sun was setting by the time they reached town, the buildings glowing golden in the last light. At the sheriff's office, they found Deputy Morris alone, his boots propped on the desk and a dime novel open in his hands. He straightened quickly when they entered. Miss Valens, he acknowledged, eyeing Ramsey's blood-stained shirt with suspicion. What's happened? Ruth explained the ambush while Ramsey stood silently, his eyes taking in the deputy's reaction or lack thereof. When she finished, Morris sighed and reached for a pencil and paper. I'll make a report, he said without enthusiasm. But if it happened outside town limits, there's not much we can do. Sheriff's away in Tombstone till tomorrow. 3 men tried to kill us, Ruth said incredulously. And that's your response, Morris shrugged. Could have been Apaches, could have been bandits, no way to know for sure. It was the Blackwell gang, Ramsey spoke up. I recognized Blackwell's voice. They're the same men who attacked my family's ranch 6 months ago, stole our cattle, and left me for dead. The deputy's eyes narrowed. You got proof of that. My face is proof, Ramsey said coldly. Morris looked uncomfortable. Look, when the sheriff gets back, we'll see about organizing a posse, but with the limited men we've got, never mind, Ramsey cut him off. I can see we're wasting our time. Outside, Ruth caught his arm as he started toward the hotel. You can't go after them alone, she said urgently. Not now that they know you're here. I don't see much choice, Ramsey replied. The law won't help, and I won't put anyone else in danger. Ruth's grip on his arm tightened. You're not thinking clearly. We need a plan, not a suicidal confrontation. Her use of "we" caught his attention. This isn't your fight, he repeated his earlier words. They shot at me too, she reminded him. And I have resources you don't. Let me send a wire to the railroad security office in Tucson. They can have men here within 2 days. Ramsey hesitated, torn between his desire for immediate action and the logic of her argument. 2 days gives Blackwell time to disappear again, or time to set another trap, Ruth countered. Think, Ramsey, is revenge worth your life? The question hung between them as they stood in the darkening street. Finally, Ramsey nodded. Send your wire, but I'm not sitting idle while we wait. What will you do? Make some inquiries, he said. Discreetly, Blackwell and his men must be staying somewhere nearby. Someone in town might have information. Ruth studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, but promise me you won't confront them alone. I promise to be careful, he offered instead. Ruth clearly wasn't satisfied with this compromise, but she accepted it with a sigh. Let's get back to the hotel. We both need rest after today. At the hotel, they separated to clean up before dinner, agreeing to meet in the dining room in an hour. Ramsey washed away the dust and blood, changed his clothes, and re-bandaged his wound, all while his mind worked through what had happened. The Blackwell gang had recognized him and tried to finish what they'd started 6 months ago. But now they knew he was aware of their presence, which changed the dynamics of the situation. When he entered the dining room, Ruth was already seated at their usual table, wearing a simple blue dress instead of her riding clothes. Her hair was neatly arranged, and for the first time Ramsey was struck by how truly beautiful she was when not covered in trail dust. You clean up well, she said as he approached, a small smile playing at her lips. As do you, he replied, taking his seat. As they ate, Ruth informed him that she had sent the wire to Tucson and received a reply promising that railroad security men would arrive on the morning train 2 days hence. That still leaves us vulnerable tomorrow, Ramsey pointed out. I've been thinking about that, Ruth said, leaning forward slightly. I need to complete my surveys, but perhaps we should choose a different location somewhere more open with better visibility. Or you could postpone until the security men arrive, Ramsey suggested. Ruth shook her head. The railroad is expecting my complete report by the end of the month. Every day counts. She studied him across the table. Unless you'd rather not accompany me tomorrow, I'd understand given your injury. It's just a graze, he said dismissively. And I'm not letting you go out there alone, especially now, her expression softened. Thank you, though I should warn you that my original security escort may arrive on tomorrow's train. He wired that he's finished his business in Tucson earlier than expected. Good, Ramsey said. More guns on our side. They finished their meal discussing the next day's surveying location, deciding on an area north of town that offered good lines of sight in all directions. As they stood to leave the dining room, Ramsey noticed Ruth sway slightly. Are you all right? He asked, reaching out to steady her. Just tired, she admitted. The excitement of the day is catching up with me. Ramsey offered his arm. Allow me to escort you to your room. In the hallway outside their rooms, Ruth turned to face him. Thank you for saving my life today, she said quietly. You saved mine as well, he reminded her. That was quick thinking with the flare. A moment of silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken words. Finally, Ruth reached up and gently touched his scarred cheek. It was the first time anyone had deliberately touched his scar since the Apache healer. Rest well, Ramsey, she said softly, then turned and entered her room. Ramsey stood in the hallway for a long moment, his cheek tingling where her fingers had been. Something fundamental had shifted between them today, forged in the shared danger and mutual protection. He wasn't sure what to call it yet, but he knew it was changing him, changing his priorities, and perhaps even his purpose in Bisbee. The next morning, Ramsey was waiting with the horses when Ruth appeared. She looked rested, her usual competent self again, though there was a new wariness in her eyes as she scanned their surroundings. Railroad man hasn't arrived yet, Ramsey asked as he helped her secure her equipment. The morning train isn't due for another hour, Ruth explained. I left word at the station for him to follow us if he arrives. He knows the area. They rode north out of town, both more alert than usual, watching the terrain around them for any sign of threat. The location Ruth had selected for today's survey was a relatively flat plateau overlooking a potential rail corridor. It offered excellent visibility and few places for ambushers to hide. As they worked through the morning, Ramsey kept his rifle close at hand, watching the surrounding countryside while Ruth took her measurements. The sun climbed higher, baking the rocky ground and creating heat waves that distorted distant views. I think we're alone out here, Ruth commented during a water break. No sign of followers. Doesn't mean they're not planning something, Ramsey replied, scanning the horizon again. Blackwell is cunning. He wouldn't try the same approach twice. Ruth studied his tense posture. You know these men well. I've been tracking them for months, Ramsey said, learning their patterns, their habits. Before they recognized me in Bisbee, I was close to finding their hideout. What will you do when this is over? She asked suddenly. After Blackwell is dealt with one way or another, the question caught him off guard. For so long, his sole focus had been finding the men who had attacked his family and exacting justice. He hadn't thought much beyond that goal. Go home, I suppose, he said after a moment, back to the ranch. My brother could use the help. Is that what you want? Ramsey looked at her, realizing she had asked the one question no one else had thought to ask. Was revenge and then a return to his former life what he truly wanted? Before he could answer, the distant sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. Ramsey reached for his rifle, but Ruth placed a hand on his arm. That's probably Jackson, she said, referring to her railroad security escort. He'd be coming from this direction if he followed my instructions. Sure enough, a lone rider appeared, approaching at an easy trot. As he drew closer, Ramsey could make out a stocky man in his 40s wearing the dust-colored clothes of a frontier lawman and a badge pinned to his vest. Miss Valens, the man called as he rode up. Found your message at the station. Figured I'd better join you straight away, Mr. Jackson, Ruth greeted him. Thank you for coming. This is Ramsey Cooper, who's been assisting me the past few days. Jackson nodded to Ramsey, his eyes lingering briefly on the scar. Marshal Tim Jackson, Railroad Security. Miss Valens mentioned in her message that you folks had some trouble yesterday. Ramsey quickly explained the ambush while Jackson listened with professional attention. Blackwell gang, the marshal mused when Ramsey finished. They've been on our watch list for a while, hitting supply trains, rustling cattle from ranches near the lines. He looked at Ramsey's scar with new understanding. They did that to you? 6 months ago, Ramsey confirmed. Left me for dead after stealing my family's cattle. Jackson nodded grimly. Well, they just made a big mistake hitting a railroad survey team. The company doesn't take kindly to that sort of interference. He turned to Ruth. My men will be here tomorrow morning like you requested. Until then, I suggest you both stay in town. I need to finish these measurements today, Ruth said firmly. We're well positioned here with good visibility. Jackson scanned the area and nodded reluctantly. All right, but we head back by mid-afternoon. No sense pushing our luck. With the marshal's added protection, they were able to complete Ruth's survey work efficiently. By early afternoon, they were packing up to return to Bisbee. I've got what I need for now, Ruth said, securing her equipment. The rest can wait until we have more security. As they rode back toward town, Jackson positioned himself slightly ahead, his experienced eyes constantly scanning the terrain. Ramsey brought up the rear, equally vigilant. Your marshal seems competent, Ramsey commented quietly to Ruth as they rode. He's one of the best, she confirmed. Former Army scout during the Apache campaigns, the railroad hired him to protect their interests in the territory. They reached Bisbee without incident, the town bustling with afternoon activity. At the hotel, Jackson took his leave of them, promising to return in the morning with his men. Stay inside tonight, he advised. No sense making yourselves targets. After he departed, Ramsey turned to Ruth. He's right, we should stay in the hotel until morning. Ruth nodded her agreement. I have plenty of calculations to work on from today's measurements. Though I should warn you, I'll be poor company for dinner. These figures require concentration. I understand, Ramsey said, though he felt a twinge of disappointment. I have some inquiries to make anyway. Ruth's eyes narrowed. Nothing dangerous, I hope. You promise to be careful. Just some quiet conversations, he assured her. Information gathering, nothing that would break my promise. She didn't look entirely convinced, but nodded. I'll see you at dinner then. Ramsey spent the afternoon making discreet inquiries around town at the livery stable, the general store, and finally, the saloon. He was careful to keep his questions casual, just a visitor interested in local gossip. By late afternoon, he had confirmed that a group of riders matching the Blackwell gang's description had been seen at a remote ranch about 10 miles south of town. They'd been coming in for supplies every few days, always well armed and flush with cash. As he was leaving the saloon to return to the hotel, a hand gripped his arm, pulling him into the shadow between buildings. Ramsey reached for his gun but froze when he found himself staring into the barrel of a revolver. "Easy, Cooper," a familiar voice said. "Just want to talk." Deputy Morris stood before him, his expression grim in the fading light. "You've got a strange way of starting a conversation," Ramsey said, slowly lowering his hand from his holster. Morris glanced around nervously. "Not here, follow me." Keeping his gun trained on Ramsey, the deputy led him behind the buildings to a small storage shed. Once inside, Morris closed the door but kept his revolver ready. "You've been asking questions about the Blackwell gang," he stated. "That's my business," Ramsey replied coldly. "It's about to get you killed," Morris said, "and probably that surveyor woman too." Ramsey stiffened. "Is that a threat, a warning?" Morris corrected, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Look, there's things you don't understand about Bisbee, about how things work here." "Enlighten me," Ramsey said, his voice dangerously quiet. Morris ran a nervous hand through his hair. "The Blackwell gang, they've got arrangements with certain people in town, people who benefit from looking the other way." "The sheriff," Ramsey guessed. Morris nodded reluctantly. "Among others. The gang rustles cattle from ranches outside the county, sells the beef to the mining companies at cut rates. Everybody wins except the ranchers, of course. And my family," Ramsey added bitterly. "Yeah," Morris had the decency to look ashamed. "That's why your complaints went nowhere, why no posse was ever formed." "Why are you telling me this?" Morris holstered his gun with a sigh. "Because Lee Blackwell is planning to hit the hotel tonight. He knows you're staying there, knows about the woman too. Says you both need to be eliminated before that railroad security arrives tomorrow." Ramsey's blood ran cold. "How do you know this?" "I was there when they planned it," Morris admitted. "They don't go anywhere without checking with the sheriff first. Make sure the law will be looking the other way. And you're willing to let them murder 2 innocent people." Morris looked away. "I signed on to be a lawman, not an accessory to murder. That's why I'm here." "What's their plan?" Ramsey demanded. "Fire," Morris said grimly. "They're going to set fire to the hotel around midnight, create confusion, pick you both off in the chaos." Ramsey's mind raced, processing this information. "Why should I believe you?" "Because I'm risking my neck telling you this," Morris replied. "If Blackwell or the sheriff finds out I warned you, I'm as good as dead." Ramsey studied the deputy, seeing the fear and conflict in his eyes. Despite his instinct for caution, he believed the man was telling the truth. "What's your suggestion?" he asked finally. "Get out of town," Morris said. "Tonight, both of you. Come back when those railroad men arrive tomorrow if you want, but don't stay in that hotel tonight." Ramsey nodded slowly. "I appreciate the warning, deputy." Morris stepped back, opening the shed door a crack and peering out. "Coast is clear. I was never here, Cooper. Remember that." As the deputy slipped away into the gathering dusk, Ramsey made his way quickly back to the hotel. He found Ruth in the dining room, her table covered with papers filled with calculations and diagrams. "We need to talk," he said quietly, sitting across from her. "Privately." Ruth looked up, instantly alert at his tone. "What's happened?" "Not here," Ramsey insisted, glancing around the dining room. "Can you pack your essential belongings quickly? We need to leave." To her credit, Ruth asked no further questions, simply gathering her papers efficiently. "Give me 10 minutes," she said, rising from the table. Exactly 10 minutes later, they met in the hotel's back hallway, both carrying small bags with their most important possessions. Ramsey quickly explained what Deputy Morris had told him as they made their way to the stable. "You believe him?" Ruth asked as they saddled their horses. "I do," Ramsey confirmed. The fear in his eyes was genuine, and it explains why the law has been so ineffective against the Blackwell gang. "Where will we go?" "There's a line shack about 5 miles north of town," Ramsey said. "I noticed it during our ride today. It should be safe for the night, and we can return in the morning when Jackson and his men arrive." Ruth nodded, securing her surveying equipment and mounting her horse. "Lead the way." They rode out of town using back streets, avoiding the main thoroughfare where they might be noticed. Once clear of Bisbee, they pushed their horses to a steady trot, making good time in the clear night. The stars overhead provided enough light to follow the trail without difficulty. The line shack was much like the one they'd sheltered in during the rainstorm, a simple one-room structure with a small stove, rough shelves, and not much else. Ramsey quickly checked it for occupants or unwelcome creatures, then helped Ruth bring their belongings inside. "It's not the Copper Queen Hotel," he apologized as he lit the lantern he'd brought. Ruth smiled, setting down her bag. "After spending months surveying remote territories, this looks positively luxurious." Ramsey built a small fire in the stove, careful to keep it minimal so the smoke wouldn't be visible from a distance. The night was cool but not cold, and the shack warmed quickly. They ate the provisions they'd hastily packed: bread, cheese, and jerky sitting on their bedrolls near the stove. The situation created an intimacy neither had anticipated, but Ruth seemed remarkably composed. "You think they'll search for us when they discover we're gone?" she asked, accepting the canteen Ramsey offered. "Possibly," he admitted, "but they'll have to be careful." The fire at the hotel was meant to look like an accident. If they start openly hunting us, they risk exposing themselves. Ruth nodded thoughtfully. "And tomorrow, when Jackson arrives with his men, the dynamics will change completely." "The Blackwell gang may decide to leave the area entirely," Ramsey suggested. "They've evaded capture this long by knowing when to move on. And what would that mean for your quest for justice?" Ruth asked quietly. Ramsey stared into the small fire, considering her question. For months, his sole focus had been finding the men who had attacked him and his family. Now, on the verge of confrontation, he found his motivations shifting. "I still want justice," he said finally, "but I'm starting to see that doesn't necessarily mean blood." Ruth studied him in the flickering light. "What changed?" Ramsey met her gaze. "You," he said simply, "seeing things through your eyes, remembering there's more to life than revenge." The admission hung in the air between them, more revealing than he had intended. Ruth's expression softened, and she reached across the small space to touch his hand. "The scar doesn't define you, Ramsey," she said quietly. "Neither does what was done to you." "For a long time it did," he admitted. "It was all I could see when I looked in the mirror, all I thought about when I woke each morning. And now," he turned his hand to hold hers, "now I'm starting to see other possibilities." The look they shared needed no words. Something had been building between them since that first dinner at the hotel, a connection neither had anticipated but both now acknowledged. Ruth moved closer, her eyes never leaving his. When she reached up to touch his scarred cheek, Ramsey didn't turn away. "I don't mind what the world sees," she whispered. "I see you." The kiss that followed was gentle at first, tentative, then deepening with shared emotion. When they finally parted, Ramsey felt as though something long frozen within him had begun to thaw. "I never expected this," he said softly. "When I came to Bisbee, I was only looking for revenge. And I was only looking for the best route for a railroad," Ruth replied with a small smile. "Life has a way of offering unexpected diversions." They talked long into the night, sharing stories from their lives, discovering connections and differences, building something new from the danger they had faced together. Eventually, they settled on their bedrolls on opposite sides of the small room, though neither found sleep easily, aware of each other's presence in the intimate space. Dawn came with a chorus of desert birds and the soft golden light of early morning. Ramsey woke first, adding wood to the banked coals in the stove and heating water for coffee. When Ruth stirred, her hair tousled from sleep, he found himself smiling at the sight. "Good morning," she said, her own smile mirroring his. "I trust we survived the night without attack." "Not a soul came near," Ramsey confirmed, handing her a cup of strong coffee. "We should head back to town soon. Jackson and his men will be arriving on the morning train." They packed their belongings and ate a quick breakfast before saddling the horses. The ride back to Bisbee was quiet but companionable, both alert for any sign of danger but finding none. As they approached town, smoke was visible rising from the direction of the hotel. "They went ahead with their plan," Ruth said grimly, "even without us there." Bisbee was in chaos when they arrived, townspeople forming bucket brigades while the Copper Queen Hotel smoldered. The fire had been contained, but not before causing significant damage to one wing of the building. "Thank God we left when we did," Ruth murmured as they dismounted at the livery stable. "Cooper," a voice called, and they turned to see Marshal Jackson striding toward them, flanked by 4 hard-looking men wearing railroad security badges. "Been looking for you too. Heard about the fire and feared the worst. We received a warning and left town last night," Ramsey explained. Jackson's expression darkened. "Blackwell's work, according to our source, yes," Ramsey confirmed. "Well, he just made a serious mistake," Jackson said grimly. "Burning down property in a town with railroad interests crosses a line. My men and I are authorized to take whatever actions necessary to protect company assets and personnel." Ruth stepped forward. "What's your plan, Marshal?" "First, we secure your safety," Jackson said. "Then we pay a visit to this sheriff. I've been hearing about the one who seems unable to locate known criminals operating in his jurisdiction." "And then?" Ramsey asked. "Then we find Blackwell and his gang," Jackson stated flatly, "dead or alive." The next few hours passed in a flurry of activity. Jackson established temporary lodgings for Ruth and Ramsey at the assay office, which had secure rooms and trustworthy staff. He then confronted the sheriff, who had mysteriously returned from Tombstone just after the fire. The confrontation was brief, but effective, faced with federal marshals and the power of the railroad company. The corrupt lawman quickly offered information on the Blackwell gang's location in exchange for leniency. By mid-afternoon, Jackson had organized a posse consisting of his men, several trustworthy townspeople, and Ramsey. Ruth had insisted on accompanying them to a safe observation point, refusing to be left behind entirely. "This is still my fight," Ramsey told her as they prepared to ride out. "I need to see it through." "I understand," she said, touching his arm. "Just remember what we talked about last night. Justice doesn't always require blood." The Blackwell gang had established their hideout at an abandoned ranch 10 miles south of Bisbee. The approach was carefully planned, with Jackson's men circling the property to cut off escape routes while Jackson, Ramsey, and 2 deputies approached directly. As they came within sight of the ranch house, Jackson raised a hand to halt their advance. "We'll call them out first," he decided. "Give them a chance to surrender." Ramsey nodded, though his heart pounded with 6 months of anticipation. The men who had scarred him, killed his ranch hand, and stolen his cattle were just yards away. Jackson's voice boomed across the open space. "Illy Blackwell. This is Marshal Tim Jackson, Railroad Security. You and your men are surrounded. Come out with your hands up." For a long moment, silence was the only response. Then the crack of a rifle shot answered, kicking up dirt near Jackson's horse. "That's your answer, Marshal," Ramsey said grimly. What followed was a tense exchange of gunfire as Blackwell and his men attempted to fight their way out. But Jackson had positioned his forces well, and the gang found themselves truly trapped. After 20 minutes of sporadic shooting, a voice called out from the ranch house. "Hold your fire." "We're coming out." One by one, the members of the Blackwell gang emerged, hands raised. Last to exit was Illy Blackwell himself, a tall man with a scar of his own running across his forehead. As the outlaws were disarmed and secured, Blackwell's eyes fell on Ramsey. Recognition flickered in his gaze. Well, well, he drawled. The dead man rides again. Should have made sure of you when I had the chance. Ramsey dismounted and approached the outlaw, his hand resting on his holstered revolver. For 6 months, he had imagined this moment coming face to face with the man who had scarred him both physically and emotionally. You took something from me, Ramsey said quietly, something that can't be replaced. Blackwell's smirk faltered slightly. Just business, Cooper, nothing personal. It was personal to Francisco, Ramsey replied coldly. The man you gunned down, and to my family who worked years building that herd you stole. So what now? Blackwell challenged. You going to gun me down in cold blood, prove you're no better than me? Ramsey's hand tightened on his revolver. It would be so easy to draw and fire, to end the man who had caused so much pain. In his mind, he could hear his own blood pounding, could see Francisco falling, could feel the searing pain of the bullet tearing along his face. But then another image came to him, Ruth's eyes as she touched his scar, her words. I don't mind what the world sees. Slowly, Ramsey removed his hand from his gun. No, he said, you'll face a judge and jury. That's the justice you denied to Francisco. Blackwell's expression twisted with contempt. Gone soft because of that scar, Cooper, or is it the woman I've heard about? Neither, Ramsey replied evenly. I just decided you're not worth sacrificing my soul for. He turned and walked away, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders with each step. Behind him, he heard Jackson ordering his men to secure the prisoners for transport back to Bisbee. Ruth was waiting at the agreed observation point, her face lighting with relief when she saw him riding toward her, unharmed. It's done, she asked as he dismounted. It's done, he confirmed. Blackwell and his entire gang are in custody. They'll stand trial for multiple counts of murder, rustling, and now arson. And you, she asked softly, how do you feel? Ramsey considered the question carefully, like I can finally look forward instead of back. Ruth smiled, reaching up to touch his scarred cheek in what had become a gesture of intimacy between them. And what do you see when you look forward? Ramsey covered her hand with his own. Possibilities I hadn't considered before I met you. 3 days later, the Copper Queen Hotel was partially reopened, though repairs continued on the fire-damaged wing. Ramsey and Ruth had returned to their surveying work, now with a permanent escort of railroad security until the area was deemed completely safe. The corrupt sheriff had been arrested by federal marshals on charges of conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Deputy Morris, having come forward with his full testimony, was appointed acting sheriff until elections could be held. As for the Blackwell gang, they were transported to Tucson to await trial, the evidence against them overwhelming with both Ramsey's testimony and the corrupt sheriff's confession. On their last evening in Bisbee, Ramsey and Ruth sat together on the hotel's veranda, watching the sunset paint the surrounding hills in shades of gold and crimson. I leave for Tucson tomorrow, Ruth said, her hand resting lightly in Ramsey's. The railroad wants my final report on the proposed route. And then, Ramsey asked, the question carrying more weight than its simplicity suggested. Ruth turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the sunset glow. Then I'm assigned to the next survey. There's talk of extending the line toward New Mexico territory. Ramsey nodded, feeling a tightness in his chest at the thought of her leaving. Your work takes you far and wide. It does, she agreed, though I've been thinking about that recently. Oh, he prompted when she didn't continue. Ruth shifted to face him more directly. The railroad has offered me a position in their regional planning office in Tucson. Less field work, more oversight of multiple survey teams. I'd still travel, but I'd have a home base. And you're considering it? Ramsey asked, hope rising despite his effort to remain neutral. I am, she said, for various reasons. Her eyes held his, conveying what words had not yet expressed. Ramsey took a deep breath. I need to return to my family's ranch, he said. My brother has been managing alone too long. I understand, Ruth replied, a hint of disappointment in her voice. But, Ramsey continued, Tombstone is less than a day's ride from Tucson. Ruth's expression brightened. Is it now? I hadn't realized the geography was so convenient. Very convenient, Ramsey agreed, a smile tugging at his lips. Especially for a man who might have business in Tucson regularly, cattle sales, supplies, visiting certain railroad officials. That does sound practical, Ruth said, matching his smile, from a business perspective. Ramsey reached up to touch her cheek, mirroring her gesture of acceptance. Ruth Valens, these past days have changed me in ways I never expected. I came to Bisbee looking for revenge and found something far more valuable. And what was that? She asked softly, though her eyes suggested she already knew the answer. A future, he said simply, one I'd very much like to explore with you if you're willing. Ruth's answer came not in words but in the kiss she placed gently on his lips, unconcerned about who might see them on the public veranda. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his. I've surveyed enough territory to know when I've found exactly what I've been looking for, she whispered. 6 months later, on a clear spring day, Ramsey Cooper stood on the platform of the Tucson Railroad station, watching the incoming train from California with anticipation. At his side was his brother Thomas, nervously adjusting his tie. Stop fidgeting, Ramsey told him with a smile. She's going to like you just fine. Easy for you to say, Thomas grumbled. You're not meeting your future sister-in-law for the first time. The train pulled into the station amid clouds of steam and the squeal of brakes. Passengers began disembarking, and Ramsey scanned the crowd eagerly until he spotted a familiar figure in a practical traveling dress. Ruth's face lit up when she saw him, and she quickened her pace, navigating through the crowd with the efficiency he had come to admire. Behind her came a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to Ruth, the same honey-brown hair and direct gaze, though perhaps a bit softer around the edges. Ramsey, Ruth called, embracing him without hesitation. When they parted, she turned to the younger woman. This is my sister, Emily. Emily, this is Ramsey Cooper, and I presume this handsome gentleman is Thomas. Thomas, suddenly tongue-tied, managed a polite nod and took Emily's extended hand. Pleased to meet you, Miss Valens, he said, his voice cracking slightly. Please call me Emily, she replied with a warm smile. Ruth has told me so much about both of you. As they collected the ladies' luggage and made their way to the waiting wagon, Ramsey couldn't help but notice the way Thomas kept stealing glances at Emily, and how she seemed equally interested in him. It reminded him of his own first meetings with Ruth, though without the backdrop of danger and revenge. The Cooper Ranch had thrived in the months since Ramsey's return. With the Blackwell gang convicted and sentenced to lengthy prison terms, the territory had become safer for ranchers. The railroad connection to Bisbee had opened new markets for their cattle, and the brothers had expanded their operation. Ruth had accepted the position in Tucson, overseeing survey operations throughout the Arizona territory. She and Ramsey had courted properly despite the distance, with regular visits in both directions. 3 months ago, during a particularly beautiful desert sunset, he had asked for her hand, and she had accepted without hesitation. Now, as they rode toward town where a celebratory dinner awaited them, Ramsey found himself stealing glances at his future wife, still sometimes amazed at how his life had changed course. You're staring again, Ruth murmured, seated beside him on the wagon seat. Can't help it, he replied, not bothering to deny it. Still can't believe my luck. Ruth smiled, her hand finding his. It wasn't luck, Ramsey. It was courage, yours and mine, the courage to see beyond what others might see. From the back of the wagon, Emily's laugh rang out at something Thomas had said, the sound bright and hopeful in the clear desert air. Sounds like they're getting along, Ramsey observed. I thought they might, Ruth said with a satisfied smile. Emily has always had an appreciation for quiet strength, like her sister. 2 months later, on a perfect summer evening, Ramsey stood under an arch of desert flowers outside the newly completed church in Tombstone. Beside him stood Thomas, serving as best man, and before them, the small gathering of friends and family who had come to witness the union. When Ruth appeared at the church door on the arm of Marshal Jackson, who had happily agreed to give her away, Ramsey felt his breath catch. She wore a simple gown of ivory silk, her honey-brown hair adorned with desert blossoms, her face radiant with happiness. As she walked toward him, Ramsey was acutely aware of his scar, visible to all in the bright evening light. Yet for the first time since receiving it, he felt no urge to turn away or hide. Ruth had taught him to see it differently, not as a mark of victimhood, but as a sign of survival. When she reached him and took his hands, her eyes held his with the same directness they had shown from their first meeting. "You look beautiful," he whispered. "So do you," she replied with a small smile. "All of you." The ceremony was brief but meaningful, the couple exchanging vows they had written themselves. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Ramsey felt as though his life had come full circle from the darkest moment in that dry wash where he had nearly died, to this brightest of days where a new life began. At the reception, held in the town square under strands of lanterns, they danced together for the first time as husband and wife. As they moved across the makeshift dance floor, Ramsey noticed how no one looked away from his scarred face. Instead, they saw what Ruth had always seen: a whole man, defined not by his wounds but by his strength in overcoming them. "Happy, Mrs. Cooper?" he asked, holding her close as the music played. "Completely," she replied, "though I'll still be Miss Valens at work. I've developed quite a reputation with that name in railroad circles." "As you should," Ramsey agreed. "I wouldn't have it any other way." Ruth's eyes sparkled with mischief. "I do have some news that might interest you." "Oh." "The railroad is establishing a permanent office in Tombstone," she said casually. "They'll need someone to oversee operations here." Ramsey stopped dancing, staring at her in surprise. "And would that someone be you, if I accept the position?" she confirmed. "It would mean less travel, more stability." "Is that what you want?" he asked, knowing how she valued her independence and the variety her work provided. Ruth's expression softened. "What I want is a life with you, Ramsey, a home we build together, and perhaps—" She hesitated, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "A family in time." Joy washed through him at her words. "Nothing would make me happier," he said, drawing her closer. "Our home is wherever we're together." Later that night, after the celebrations had ended and they were alone in the small house they had purchased in Tombstone, Ramsey stood by the window, looking out at the star-filled desert sky. Ruth joined him, slipping her arms around his waist and resting her head against his shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. "How different my life is from what I imagined a year ago," he replied honestly. "How close I came to letting bitterness consume me." Ruth turned him to face her, her hands gentle on his cheeks, both the smooth and the scarred. "But you didn't let it," she reminded him. "You chose a different path." "Because of you," Ramsey said. "Because you saw beyond the scar." Ruth smiled, a tender expression that never failed to warm his heart. "I saw you, Ramsey Cooper, and I liked what I saw." As he held her close, Ramsey reflected on the strange and winding path that had brought him to this moment. A bullet meant to kill him had instead marked him, setting him on a journey of vengeance that had unexpectedly led to love. His scar, once a symbol of loss and pain, had become part of a different story, one of healing, growth, and new beginnings. Outside, the desert night wrapped around their home like a protective blanket. Inside, two people who had found each other against all odds began their life together, their shared gaze turned not toward the past, but toward the future they would build together. And in that quiet moment, Ramsey finally understood what the old Apache healer had meant. His scar would always remain, not just as a reminder of what was taken, but as evidence of what he had found the courage to begin again, and the woman who didn't mind what the world saw because she saw him.